Hello, you're watching Impact with me, Tim Willcox. The EU says it will impose new sanctions on Belarus over its treatment of migrants as thousands camp at the border seeking entry into Poland. I'll be talking to a Polish journalist who's actually on the border. Pledges to cut emissions at COP26 so far will only have a minimal effect on temperature rises this century. That's the UN's latest verdict.
When we look at what has come in the additional pledges, frankly, it's the elephant giving birth to a mouse.
After the brutal Balkans War of the 1990s, fresh instability in Bosnia and warnings of an existential threat. We'll hear from the UN High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina about the instability in a fragile state. That's all coming up here on Impact. Hello, welcome to the programme. The European Union has warned it will impose additional sanctions on Belarus because of its treatment of migrants at the border with Poland. Tensions have been escalating along the 400-kilometre stretch of land, and thousands of migrants are now caught up in a growing row between the two nations, with Poland warning of a possible armed escalation. Well, this is where it's happening, along a restricted zone in the Polish town of Kutnica. Video footage has shown migrants in Belarus being encouraged to head towards the frontier. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams has the latest.
Attention, attention.
A cold, bleak start to another day on the Polish border. Thousands of migrants, mostly Iraqi Kurds, spent a freezing night out in the open, waiting for a chance to cross into the EU. But Poland is adamant, determined to defend its borders, accusing Belarus of orchestrating the whole crisis. The Polish Prime Minister visited the border this morning. He says the security of the EU is at stake and that the President of Belarus is using civilians as a weapon.
We know that this is a fully planned operation which aims to disrupt the sovereignty of our country. That's absolutely clear to us. We know for sure that there is a search for weak spots happening on the border.
Yesterday, frustration turned to anger. For months, migrants have tried to cross in small groups through the forest. With winter approaching, they're losing hope and becoming desperate.
Well, there is no legal way for them to cross the border in the space which is not designed for that. It's also risky, and we have had noticed fatalities when people lost their way in the woods, in the rivers, in the swamps, with temperatures which are now in Poland already sub-zero temperatures.
Poland has stepped up security along the border. The EU and NATO have both said they're ready to help. There's talk from Brussels of further rounds of sanctions against Belarus. Minsk says it's not responsible, but critics of the Belarusian government say there's little doubt.
Actually, the Belarusian regime is involved in migration smuggling because there is evidence already that there were state-owned tourism agencies in Belarus that actually sold these tourism packages to migrants in the Middle East to come to Belarus and then travel to the EU.
And so the standoff continues. Civilians trapped in appalling conditions. The UN says it's alarmed. The use of refugees to achieve political ends, it says, must stop. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Well, Yanni Prauman is the director of the think tank Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. And I asked him what the thinking was behind President Lukashenko's latest actions.
The Belarusian government says that, judging by the public statements, says at least two important things. First of all, they say that since the August 2020, that is since the presidential election in Belarus of last year, the sanctions that the EU introduced have made it impossible for the government to fulfill fully its obligations when it comes to the border security issues within the framework of a couple of agreements. But also they say, and that's another thing, is that the EU has refused to hold any talks with the Belarusian government ever since the beginning of this year. And apparently the Belarusian government initiated such talks several times.
I realise you don't speak for President Lukashenko, and we're talking to you because I'm hoping you will be able to give us an insight into perhaps how the administration there is thinking, which is why we are talking to you now. But when you're looking at the flights being organised by Belarus, for example, to bring people over and to bus them effectively to different borders, isn't that just purely a provocation by the Belarusian government as a way of trying to combat or to try and escalate dialogue to change the sanctions that the EU and the West have imposed?
Well, again, that's exactly the narrative that we hear from the EU side, and I do understand this narrative perfectly well. But then what we hear in response by the Lukashenko government is that, as I already mentioned, first of all, there has been no willing whatsoever on the EU side to enter a negotiation table and have these matters discussed. But also they say that while they continue performing all the security measures in the interest of the Belarusian states, they are no longer in a position to ensure the security of the EU. And that's how they explain this overall flow of migration. They also say that they don't basically provoke anything, but when there is demand for those flights into the country, those flights take place. So that's the explanation we hear. Again, I understand these are two incompatible narratives, and at some point, to be honest with you, I have this feeling that we simply need some adults in the room on both sides to, start thinking a little bit strategically about things which might evolve even further. And if they do, I think the crisis will become enormous. And if this is the case, this is something no one wants.
So, two parallel narratives from Minsk and Warsaw. Let's see what's happening on the border. We can speak to Dmitry Mitkevich, who is a security correspondent for the Belsat TV and joins us now from the border. What is happening there at the moment? It looks as if it's getting dark. How many migrants are there?
The point is that at the moment it is really impossible even to enter the close to the border from the Polish side, because actually it's closed for journalists and for the public, because the Poland introduced the special regime on these territories. But so we're trying just to look around the border to look what is really happening. And I'd like to say that the people are telling us that at the moment there is they don't see any big flow of migrants here. But we see that, there are attempts of these organized groups of migrants still to break down this fence to enter Polish territory. Of course, it's not like it was yesterday, but still, the attempts go on. But at the moment, we don't have any information on whether they are successful or not.
What evidence have you seen of Belarusian forces trying to help them get across?
The point is that even yesterday we could look at this, videos that were distributed all over the world when these guys were trying to break down the fence. They were using the special tools that were provided by this, Lukashenko's. I even don't call them Belarusian border security because it's Lukashenko border security. And the point is that they provided these migrants with special tools and they allow them to cut trees. They also bring the stones to the place where these migrants stayed in order these migrants to throw these stones at the Polish Border Security Service, because if you enter Belarusian forest, you will never find any single stone there. The point is that they specially bring the stones, as it looks like quite natural for people throwing stones at at the border security. At the same time, they also allow them to cut trees. They also cut trees for them as well. So, they try to facilitate this kind of the storm, but at the moment we don't see any, further escalation of the things that happened yesterday. But still, the atmosphere is not so, light, I'd say.
OK, 12,000, I think, Polish troops on the border or on the border area where you are. What are conditions like for the migrants? Have camps been set up for them?
At the moment, that's the only thing that we know, that, the Polish side is trying to deal with this with this flow of migrants. But the point is that it's not so easy at the same time, because we see that the distance of the border is quite big. So they enter from, they can enter from different points. And as we know that there are already more than 6,000 of these migrants in Germany, that's why it already shows us the scale of this kind of problem, and that they still enter the territory of the European Union. And we also should know that, some of them are being kept in this migrant camps, which from the things that I know, I personally have never been there, but I can say that, people really don't say that, there are really bad conditions or something. But still, what we also hear, that there are special people in these camps that also work as provokers, that were specially brought there by Lukashenko security services for, indoctrinating these migrants that are there, for not to cooperate with the Polish authorities, not to disclose information, and so on and so forth.
All right, Dmitry Mickiewicz, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, there's been a gloomy assessment by the UN of progress made so far at the Glasgow Climate Summit. New national emissions cutting pledges, including a vow last week by India to be carbon neutral by 2070, are likely to have a minimal effect on temperature rises this century. Speaking at the COP26, the head of the UN Environment Programme argued that most of the pledges that have been made are vague, lack transparency, and are hard to hold to account.
Look, at this point, when we look at what has come in the additional pledges, frankly, it's the elephant giving birth to a mouse. So we need to think about whether that is good enough and whether we can stretch more.
Well, let's go to our science correspondent, Rebecca Morell, who joins us now from Glasgow. A pretty underwhelmed UN.
Yeah, that's right. And there's been another new analysis just released too by the Climate Action Tracker, which basically tots up all of the climate pledges offered by every country here and sees how that actually translates into global temperature rise. And the numbers don't look good. I mean, there's quite a few of them, so I'll take you through them one by one. I mean, the key number here is 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's what the conference is trying to do, to keep that number on the table, because if temperatures go above that, we move into dangerous climate territory, and we're already at 1.2 degrees. That's the reality right now, so there's not much further to go. Now, if you tot up all of the pledges, and especially the longer term ones, cutting emissions to get to net zero by 2050, and countries do that, they actually sort of achieve those promises, well, that would take global temperature rise down to 1.8 degrees Celsius, but that is a very optimistic scenario. The truth is, if you look at the shorter term pledges that take you up to 2030, well, that puts temperatures on a trajectory to 2.4 degrees. That's a long way above that 1.5 degree figure. And even worse, if you look at the reality of what every country is doing, its policies, not its promises, well, that takes us on a trajectory to 2.7 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's over a degree above the 1.5 degree threshold, which takes us into dangerous climate change territory, frankly. It's a planet that wouldn't be very nice to live on at all. So the warning is that there's a credibility gap here at Glasgow between what's being promised and what the reality is of what we're actually seeing. I mean, we're not doing enough to cut emissions. That's the short of it. So lots of numbers there, but not a great outcome.
Yeah, I mean, the term for that is greenwashing, isn't it? I think. Of course, no China, no Russia there. Barnstorming speech by former President Obama about climate change yesterday. But in reality, looking at the detail of what America, the US, has promised, how far are they going?
Well, it's really difficult here. I mean, I think that the challenge is scientists say we need to kind of front load the action. So we need to get our climate change policies in place now. And it's really about what we do in the next 80 years that take us to 2030. So we need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by nearly half by 2030, and we're really far from that. In fact, some of the, if you tot up what's going on, the emissions are actually set to rise by about 15% over 2030. The issue is, if we're talking about kind of net zero promises by 2050 or 2060 in the case of China, or 2070 in the case of India, it's a long time. You can't leave all of the action till right at the end. You have to start doing things now, and that's the problem here.
All right, Rebecca in Glasgow, thank you. Stay with us here on Impact, still to come. What time did you go to bed last night? Well, we'll be discussing a study that links your bedtime with your health and the health of your heart.
The bombastic establishment outsider Donald Trump has defied the pollsters to take the keys to the Oval Office.
I feel great about the election results. I voted for him because I genuinely believe that he cares about the country.
It's keeping the candidate's name always in the public eye that counts. Success or failure depends not only on public display, but on the local campaign headquarters and the heavy routine work of their women volunteers.
Berliners from both east and west linked hands and danced around their liberated territory. And with nobody to stop them, it wasn't long before the first attempts were made to destroy the structure itself.
Yasser Arafat, who dominated the Palestinian cause for so long, has died. Palestinian Authority has declared a state of mourning.
After 17 years of discussion, the result was greeted with an outburst of joy. Women ministers who'd long felt only grudgingly accepted among the ranks of clergy suddenly felt welcome.
Hello, you're watching Impact on BBC World News. The US envoy to the Western Balkans has stated that there will be no war in Bosnia. That follows crisis talks with all three members of the ethnically shared presidency. Tensions, though, have been high since the leader of the majority ethnic Serb population, Milorad Dodik, proposed to withdraw from national institutions, including the Bosnian Armed Forces. That prompted warnings of an existential threat to the country. Well, the UN High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, Christian Schmidt, made those warnings, and he said the international community now needed to give a clear message not to challenge the status quo.
Due to the first-time open challenge to the international community's set ceasefire and peace stabilization project linked with the Dayton Peace General Framework for Peace is challenged by Mr. Dodik and his announcement to retire from nearly all state legislation, including the army. So I would say this is the time and the place where the international community has to underline very clearly that Dayton remains the basis of a peaceful development of the hopefully future European Union member state, Bosnia and Herzegovina.
But how did this start? What was the genesis of this?
It is, if you accept, with all respect to the region I'm just staying in, this is a lot of Balkanese rhetoric for years. Unfortunately, we had not made sufficiently clear from the international community that this rhetoric is the first step probably to come to a narrative which is in this high tension of public debate in this region, could challenge and could cause not only, do not talk now in the beginning about violence, but could cause severe affecting the state organization as well. So we now finding a state where some people do want to have a dissolution. Somebody Dodik said he wants a peaceful dissolution. Some responsible people around in this region said to me, there is no peaceful dissolution.
Well, he says, Mr. Schmidt, that he's not a secessionist, isn't he? Yes, he wants a separate army, and that will be a terrifying prospect for people who lived through and remember the war. He also says that there are at least 7 EU countries who support him.
This is just the typical attempt to make people feeling well. They do not feel well, and better, not with his rhetoric, but with his activities, he could prove that we are right and that he supports us. So this would include no legislation on the entity level against the state, probably sitting together and talking about things, what could be improved in legislation on the state level or where else. That's not the problem. This is democracy about. But just to challenge the state as a whole, and he does it, needs a very clear answer.
Christian Schmidt speaking to me a little earlier. Now, a study in Britain has found that people who go to bed between 10 and 11 o'clock in the evening have better heart health than those with earlier or later bedtimes. Well, the researchers studied the sleep habits of 88,000 people, volunteers, and found that those who stuck to that bedtime had a lower risk of heart attacks and strokes compared with people going to sleep between 10 p.m. and 10:59 p.m. Those with bedtimes after midnight had a 25% higher risk of cardiovascular disease. And those who fell asleep before 10 p.m. a 24% raised risk. They say more research is needed to try and understand why this is the case, but they believe that synchronizing sleep to match our internal body clock, the circadian cycle, might be important. Let's get more on this. We can speak now to Dr. Met Aral, who is head of research at health tech firm Humour. He is one of the authors of today's report. What time did you get to bed last night?
Very good question, actually. I managed to get to bed around 11 o'clock, but I have two young daughters, 3 and 5 years old, and they were up all night. So I actually had a terrible night last night. So
well, I hope that doesn't. I hope that doesn't continue. Just in terms of the cardiovascular disease that you've identified outside that sort of sweet hour, that sweet spot, 10 to 11 p.m. Why is that, do you think? I mean, there's no causal link as such, is there?
No, absolutely not. There's no causal link, and that certainly requires further investigation. I think our research really demonstrates how we can look at these types of longitudinal data sets, as well as data coming from the technology that is now available to us, things like wearables and different types of sensors that enable us to generate new insights out of this data. And that is essentially what we found. We looked at data from 88,000 individuals, followed up for about 15, 16 years. This is one of the largest, richest real-world data sets that's available out there. And from that data, we looked at information coming from wearables that these participants had worn. And from that, we could identify exactly what time they went to sleep. And because these individuals were followed up for a certain period of time, we could then assess whether there was any association with an increased cardiovascular risk. And of course, in order to look for that association, we need to adjust for all the common cardiac risk factors that we already know, things like smoking and being overweight and blood pressure. And despite adjusting for all of those risk factors, we did find an association that going to bed between 10 and 11 was the optimal time in terms of reducing that cardiovascular risk. But again, that certainly needs further investigation to look into that causality. What we found was an association.
Okay, I mean, that is still fascinating. And outside that magic 10 p.m. to 11 p.m, did you look at people who are working, for example, and sleeping during the day? I mean, we are a 24-hour society now, aren't we, right around the world? What difference did that make? So those perhaps doing night work?
That's right, and we didn't specifically investigate that as that level of information was not available to us within that data set. But I think what is important is that there is an internal circadian clock that we all have, and continuous disruption to that clock really causes a lot of physiological issues in our body, things like glucose metabolism and so on, causes increased inflammation. So I think what I would say is that yes, of course, we have individuals working these types of shifts and sleeping during the day, but if they can expose themselves as much to natural light to kind of regulate that internal clock, that's the best they can do, especially during their breaks and weekends. If they can try to regulate back to their normal circadian rhythm, that will be my advice. And
but that is difficult for people doing lots of night work, obviously. And is there a rule of thumb? Is there an optimum number of hours, briefly, that you should sleep?
I think the optimum number of hours, again, doesn't really exist. We always say, between 7 to 8 hours is optimum, but of course that varies for every individual. And again, I have 2 little kids, so
yeah, sure. I know. And forgive me, I can see you're suffering. You do look slightly tired. We've got to leave it there, but maybe it's time to just get to 40 winks now, if you can. Meteral, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That is it for us from today.